As with every challenge in life, it is not only ambition and skill that determine whether one is successful or not. A certain amount of luck also plays a part. That is the random element that can tilt the odds in favor or against success. In some situations, fate can effectively remove our free will by limiting all possible choices, forcing us to go ways we didn't want to go, which eventually may lead to an endpoint we tried to avoid. Fate deals the cards and we have to play with the ones given to us. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. On the Eiger north face, a small problem can literally snowball into an avalanche of problems, eventually leading to a disaster. That situation becomes a metaphor for all critical challenges in life. In the year 1938, the dark clouds of war were gathering over Europe. It was the final year of peace before World War II. Although the tension was building up, no one knew at the time that everything was about to change. For the climbers aiming at the Eiger North Face, 1938 was just another year closer to the goal. The Eiger North Face was the extreme case of a challenge which attracted skilled climbers from near and far. By then, everyone knew that failure often led to the ultimate price to pay. Still, they chose to focus on the slim chance of success. 2 Italian climbers died on the North Face that year, Bartolo Sandri and Mario Menti. They did not go the route to the right, which passes across the Interstoice Traverse. Instead, they climbed the Meringer and Selmayr route. The 21st of June, early in the morning, they got started and they got up higher than Selmayr and Meringer that day. But in the evening, bad weather rolled in. It was the typical notorious Eiger weather. The following day, Sandri was found dead on an ice field at the foot of the mountain. Menti's dead body was found deep in a crack a few days later. Once again, it became clear that there is just a thin line between success and failure. This illustrates how quickly things can spin out of control, not because of the expected difficulties, but the random nature of life. A sudden change in weather, or just a falling rock, can turn a controlled situation into a disaster. The Austrian climbers Fritz Kasparek and Heinrich Harrer start a climb at the 21st of July at 2 a.m. They are following the same route as the team of 1936, to the right of the first pillar and past the shattered pillar. The climbers Freisel and Brankowski from Vienna turn up behind them. They had also started out that day since the weather conditions were good. Suddenly, they also discover another team in front of them, which is the Germans Andreas Heckmeyer and Ludwig Ferg. They had just left their bivouac at the lower part of the North Face. Heckmeyer and Ferg were well equipped with the latest climbing gear. Harrer hadn't brought crampons, since he got the impression there wouldn't be so much ice and snow, rather more rock climbing. That turned out to be a miscalculation, but it was okay, since Kasparek had crampons, so he was the one to handle the ice and snow. The weather was good at the start, as in so many earlier attempts to ascend the wall, but by now everyone knew how quickly things can change on the mountain, and that underestimating that risk could lead to yet another tragedy. Heckmeyer and Ferg are obviously surprised to see 2 more teams on the North Face at the same time, and decide to pass this attempt and instead climb down. On the way up, one of Freisel and Brankowski got hit by a falling rock, and now they have to climb down. For a while, Harrer and Kasparek are the only persons on the wall. They reach the Hinterstoice Traverse before sunrise. They then discover the ropes attached by Ferg and Rebic from the previous summer. They test them out and find them firmly attached. That area was completely covered in ice, like a vertical ice rink, but they can pass it using the ropes. Then they continue past the Swallow's Nest, where they have breakfast. The weather is still good. They prepare the Swallow's Nest as a supply point, leaving some supplies in case they would need to retreat later. It is the 21st of July, the same date as Hinterstoice had tried to return past the Hinterstoice Traverse 2 years earlier. Hinterstoiser opened up that route, and that tragedy taught the followers about the importance of being prepared. Fritz Kasparek then takes the lead, crossing the first ice field using crampons. Then he advances through the ice hose to the second ice field, which takes a long time due to lots of water from melting ice. It is very difficult to get grip when they get wet. They reached the second ice field early in the afternoon. They could continue to the right towards the Flatiron and up to the Death Bivouac, but instead they go to the right just over the red cliff to get away from falling rocks and ice from the White Spider. It is better to cross the second ice field early in the morning, since it's lower risk for rockfall from the mountain when the mountain is frozen and better held together. They hack out seats in the ice as a first bivouac. That night is cold and unpleasant. In the morning they start the sideways movement of the second ice field. Kasparek hacks a ladder in the ice, since Harrer didn't have crampons. Just before the rocks between the second and third ice field, Heckmeyer and Ferg approaches rapidly from behind them and passes them by. From that point, the two teams continue climbing close to each other. Heckmeyer and Ferg obviously saw Freisel and Brankovsky return and decided to go back to the mountain to start a new ascent. Apparently they thought 3 teams on the wall was too crowded, but 2 teams would be okay. Together they continue over the Flatiron and towards the Death Bivouac, where they have dinner break. There is a mist and clouds coming in. They then move on over the third ice field towards the ramp. The 2 teams meet and prepare bivouac on the narrow part of the ramp. Early the next morning, Heckmeyer and Ferg start climbing through the crack in the narrow part of the ramp. Heckmeyer takes the lead. The water there is frozen to ice, and after some hard tries, Heckmeyer managed to get over the ice edge, and they can move on to the right across the Traverse of the Gods. Then the sky becomes dark in the early afternoon, and a thunderstorm is rolling in. They move on towards the White Spider while the sky is getting dark blue. It is a hailstorm with snow, thunder and lightning. Now Heckmeyer and Ferg is at the upper part of the spider. The spider's legs are spreading out upwards and down. When it snows and hails, the arms upwards are channeling snow and ice from the top ice fields along the legs. All this ice and snow gather with concentrated pressure at the spider's body as snow sweeps over the wall. That makes it a very dangerous place to be in during bad weather or during avalanches. That was exactly what happened at that point. They were surprised by a sudden avalanche, which came in 2 waves and almost swept them off the mountain. Harrer managed to hold on to a rope and protected himself with a backpack over his head, while still securing Kasparek, who was climbing above him. Miraculously, Kasparek never got swept away by the avalanche, although he had only a peg shallowly attached. He protected it with his arm and hand, which got injured by falling ice. Before the second wave came, he had time to drive in the peg deeper and attached himself to it with a carabiner. The avalanche was a bit less powerful further up where Heckmeyer was, so he could hold on to the mountain with an ice axe, while at the same time helping Ferg by holding on to him. They all gathered afterwards at the upper part of the spider, presumably surprised that they all survived that incident. From that point on, they continued as one team. They move on up above the spider to about 3,750 meters altitude, where they prepare their last bivouac. The weather deteriorates. The next morning, they throw away unnecessary supplies to reduce the backpack weight and continue into the snowstorm. Heckmeyer and Ferg have the leading position. There is an incident at one point where Heckmeyer loses his grip when trying to climb an icy part and falls down towards Ferg, who then catches him. But Heckmeyer's crampons cut deep into Ferg's hand, which starts bleeding ominously. After stopping the blood and having half a bottle of strong medicine, they now continue towards the exit crack and reach the summit ice field at about noon. There, the visibility deteriorates due to the snowstorm. At 1 p.m., they were all at the edge of the summit ice field. Now they had to follow the ridge up to the right all the way to the summit. After about 2 hours in the snowstorm, the limited visibility almost made them go over the edge to the south face, but no mistake was made and they could continue. They reached the summit at 4:30 p.m. the 24th of July 1938. They stay a short while at the top in the bad weather before starting their descent along the west flank. Even the last bit is hard due to deep and heavy wet snow. When arriving in Kleine Scheidegg, they were greeted by lots of people, including many representatives from the press. The first successful ascent of the Eiger North Face was now completed. The next ascent would be many years later, in 1946, since the Second World War broke out the following year. By then, Harrer had gone to the Himalayas, where he became a prisoner of war, escaped and spent 7 years in Tibet. That is of course another story which is described in his book with exactly that name, 7 years in Tibet. So what about modern climbing? What has happened since the 1930s up to now? Although the North Face still remains a challenge for advanced climbers, much has happened since the first attempts during the 1930s. Equipment and technique has improved. Now, some climbers do solo climbs over the North Face to the summit in just a couple of hours. In 2015, Swiss climber Ueli Steck solo climbed the North Face in 2 hours and 22 minutes, mainly using crampons and 2 ice axes. That is amazingly fast. The great advantage with the fast ascent is the short time of exposure to the elements. Many of the accidents on the North Face has been related to falling rocks and ice and bad weather conditions. The idea to use light pack and move fast is not really a new idea in mountain climbing. Italian climber Reinhold Messner became well known for the fast alpine-style climbing in the Himalayas during the 1970s. Earlier ascents of Mount Everest had been expedition style with lots of people and lots of equipment, which slows down the pace. Messner also did a solo climb of Mount Everest in 1980, which is quite unbelievable. The advantage of the fast modern style climbing is in line with the Chinese strategy book The Art of War by Sun Tzu. It states that a victory long in coming will blunten the swords and dampen the ardor. In other words, the longer it takes to reach a victory, the risk for failure will increase. In the case of the Eiger, one could add that the probability for an unforeseen accident, such as a rockfall, avalanches, increases with the exposure to that risk. Short exposure to danger is better than long exposure. That is the clear advantage of a fast ascent. So what can we learn from all this that can be applied to challenges in general? These stories illustrate how quickly things can spiral out of control, sometimes because of the expected difficulties, but often because of the random nature of life. As in some of these stories, some decisions turn out to be irreversible, points of no return, which may not be apparent at the time of the decision. There is so much to say about this, but that is for another time. After a walk a few kilometers to Wengen, I took a gondola cableway back to Grindelwald. So what can I say about the visit to Kleine Scheidegg? The area I visited was far from an adventure, unless you actually intend to climb the North Face. It is a very touristy place. It is a place to visit regardless of climbing. The history of it is amazing. If you feel like going to the highest railway station in Europe, the Jungfrau Railway takes you through the Eiger. As most parts of the Alps, the mountains are very beautiful. But if you want to do a real trek, there are many places in Switzerland. For instance, I've gone several times to the neighboring canton Valais, to places like Zermatt and Saas-Fee. Finally, let's end this with some philosophical reflections. The stories about the North Face shows how things can play out. It is a metaphor for life, although in case of the Eiger, it is taking it to the extreme. It is an enterprise with the highest possible stake, one's own life. People had already ascended to the summit long before the first attempts to climb the North Face, so just reaching the top was not the goal. The route itself was the goal. The challenge was to find a way to the summit over the North Face. despite the climbing tragedies or the temporary ban on climbing the wall, and the statements about the idea of climbing it being deranged, it almost became irresistible to some people. It is as if certain challenges are seeking people rather than the other way around. The older generation's condemnation in British and German newspapers of what they called attention-seeking young climbers shows the typical conflict between generations. The generation gap is nothing new. There is a fundamental part of the human nature to overcome challenges. Seen in the long perspective, our main challenge is just survival, but as human societies evolved, to survive has become relatively easy. Our DNA is programmed to continuously handle challenges, so that is one reason. But of course, success in these well-known challenges can also lead to fame and fortune. The history of the Eiger North Face also paints a picture of how humanity systematically overcomes challenges. Here it started with the initial judgment of risk before the first attempt was made. Then, after the first tragedy in 1935, it became apparent how dangerous the climb was. The following accident further underlined the danger, but at the same time, those attempts provided information about what to avoid. What sealed the fate for so many of the climbers were the unknown, random events, not possible to control for the climbers. Being at the wrong place at the wrong time can mean being hit by a rock or ice or an avalanche. The weather can also trap climbers on the wall, which in some cases led to disasters. What can be controlled to some extent is the technical skill and the knowledge about the climb. The rest is a matter of good or bad luck. Life remains a mystery. We try to find the meaning of it in various challenges that keeps us occupied, and it distracts us from the meaninglessness of everything. The ever-expanding universe, the increasing entropy and chaos. A challenge provides a clear goal, which makes us focused. To find the way to the goal fills our thoughts and provides a meaning, which makes us feel happy. And happiness is the universal goal for all human beings. Millions of years into the future, the Alps may erode slowly as the sun fades away in the final twilight of the solar system. By then we have probably overcome unthinkable challenges along the way, which for us lay in the future. And for as long as humanity exists, most people will keep struggling with everyday challenges.